Okay, so now I'm going to talk about what is the relationship between quadrants and the x and y axis. So if you remember, we start labeling the quadrants from the top right, and then we go in a counterclockwise motion, and we label them in increasing order. So for example, this would be quadrant 1, the next one would be quadrant 2. After that, this is quadrant 3, and finally, this is quadrant 4. And remember, we label them with Roman numerals. Now, what is the relationship between these quadrants and the values on the x and y axis? If you haven't seen the video on how to plot points, then watch that video, because we're going to use the symbolic representation of points in order to show what the differences are, or what the relationship between quadrants and the x and y axis is. Now, if we have any point that's located in quadrant 1, what do we know about the x coordinate, or the x value? Well, we know that any number to the right of the origin is positive for the x-axis. So we know that any number along this axis will be in this quadrant. So all numbers will have a positive x-coordinate. You can see that clearly. I'm just going to write a positive to tell us that all x values in the first quadrant are positive. What about the y-coordinate? We know that any value above the origin for the y value is positive as well. It follows that any value in quadrant 1 will have a positive y value. Let's do the next one, quadrant 2. Any point in quadrant 2 will now have a negative x-coordinate. I'll symbolize that by writing a negative sign. And any y value in quadrant 2 will have a positive y-coordinate. What about any point in quadrant 3? We see that any value in quadrant 3, again, will have a negative x value, because it's all numbers that are located here. And also, we see that any y value for quadrant 3 will be negative as well, because all these values are negative. Finally, what about quadrant 4? We see that any value for the x along the x-axis for quadrant 4 will have to be positive, and any y value for quadrant 4 will have to be negative. Now let's just look at what we've done, and then you'll see what I mean by the relationship between the quadrants and the axes. So we see that any value in quadrant 1 has positive value for the x value and positive value for the y value. This is because of what values it can take on along the x-axis and what values it can take along the y-axis. They're both positive. For quadrant 2, the x value is negative because all the values that it could possibly take in quadrant 2 are negative x values, and all the values you can take on for quadrant 2 for the y value is positive. Continuing, quadrant 3 can only have negative values for x and y, and quadrant 4 can have a positive x value but has a negative y value. And we can see that none of them repeat. They're all distinct. They're all different. This is all positive. This is all negative. This has one positive, one negative. This has one positive, one negative. And that's the relationship between the quadrants and the y and x axis. This has to do with the points, what the values of the points are, if they're positive or negative for the x and y.